So in this case, we're looking at wineries, and we're looking at share of profit and share of revenue across various product lines, and identifying which products have the highest carbon intensity, and therefore the highest leverage in reducing carbon and maintaining profitability. Last of all, we can do forecasting of various changes. So if oil were to go to $100 a barrel and carbon at $18 a ton, we can do some scenario planning and suddenly see, for example, that both wine with 38% in now is actually highly insulated, and we can identify where we might want to focus our reduction efforts. Last of all, generically, we think that if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. I think that's sort of tried and true. So a large part of our core system capability is to help customers set targets and then manage quarterly or annually their reductions, looking at their performance across in a P&L perspective. This same kind of analysis can be done by product line or by material specifically, as it's done here in the top level of the chart. But the key is if you're going to be treating carbon as a strategic metric, we should be looking quarterly or at least semi-annually at the numbers and tracking our progress.
Chris, just a quick interruption since we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'll just read them all. One is, how did the company with the 123,000 tons of CO2 equivalents, how did they come up with that number? The second one is, what constitutes controllable, where you mentioned that? And then the third question is, how is the carbon output determined for each piece of the supply chain?
So number one, most of the numbers I showed you have been slightly modified to protect particular confidential information, but all of the numbers you saw were produced through a climate Earth hybrid analysis of the supply chain and the enterprise using WRI standard protocol methodologies. The second question was WRI is World Resources Institute. WRI-WBCSD is the generally accepted standard setter for the global standards in carbon accounting protocols. And let's see, the other question was, how is carbon output for cement measured? In this case, we used a combination of the Climate Earth database, which gave us industry averages. I'll show you more specifically that. And then we went directly to the supplier, in this case a couple of suppliers, and measured their direct emissions to calibrate and differentiate between suppliers.
And then there was a question about what's controllable versus not.
Yeah. So in that particular slide, we were looking at which emissions are more directly controllable versus indirectly controllable. And I think in that particular case, the customer felt like the shipment distances to the source or the use of the concrete was not under their control. That was more had to do with where they were located, and they felt that moving plants was not something they could control. Hopefully those answer the questions, and we'll just keep moving on into now diving into a couple of specific examples of how the type of metric I've just shown you has been used by two different companies. The first one is Playworld Systems. Playworld is a leading manufacturer of playground equipment, and to illustrate, about 90% of their emissions are in Scope 3, that is in the materials that they use to build the playground equipment. About 10% is in their manufacturing processes and painting and construction of the playgrounds. And we did not, as I mentioned, in this case, measure Scope 4, the use of the playground, which is actually a very, very low carbon emission. So the first thing we did for Playworld was to look at what is the largest impact across their enterprise. In this case, steel and plastic were their largest sources, along with aluminum. They are focusing strategically on material substitution and replacement, process redesign, and product redesign, focused on those particular components. They're also looking at aluminum recycling, heavier use of recycled products, and they're, from a cultural and human perspective, looking at their Scope 1 as well and implementing programs across the enterprise. To give a notion of sort of helping with why materiality is so important, they were looking at recycling paint, and the impact of paint going into the landfill from a toxics perspective is very high, but as you can see from a CO2 perspective, driving a few extra miles to recycle the paint is a nominal impact. So we avoided a carbon analysis, and they are recycling 100% of their paint waste and paint that's not used. Probably from a strategic perspective, the biggest impact they're having is more along the lines of carbon labeling of products. This has become part of their business process. They sell principally to cities, and as many of you may know, 900 cities in the United States signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, so carbon is an important part of their focus. And they're now marketing and working with their clients, looking at cost, functionality, and carbon footprint of every product that they sell. And it's really shifted the conversation and made them viewed as a leader and is impacting revenues for the company in a very positive way. So what have they achieved so far, if we wanted to sort of go back and summarize the achievements? First of all, their competition is reporting Scope 1 and 2, so they're reporting a very small piece of their carbon footprint. That was a challenge for them initially, trying to decide if they would report their supply chain emissions. They decided that that was the right thing to do, and it's turned out to be strategic for them. And it did involve training their sales force on how to discuss Scope 1, 2, and 3, but the customers have responded very positively to their broader look at carbon, and of course it's helped them move more product. They've also created a new framework for decision making, or I like to say a new lens for decision making. It's impacted every part of their business. They're looking at, as I mentioned, material replacement. They're looking at product redesign into the future using carbon data. They're looking at their manufacturing processes and making much more sophisticated trade-offs now over energy efficiency as well as cost and competitiveness in the future.
And Chris, is there anything that you can say in terms of revenue growth, in terms of cost reduction, or anything related to tax refunds or rebates?
Most of the initial impact has been in revenue increases, and of course it's a combination of changing the conversation with the client and beginning to discuss aspects of their product that their competition is not. So I think quantifying precisely would be both not appropriate from a confidentiality perspective, and it's also a subjective measure. From a cost perspective, they did suffer a year ago when steel prices soared. And as a result, they are redesigning and rethinking business processes around steel, but the results of that are not yet in their financials, though I think they'll show up as we start to see carbon increase over the next year or two.
And is there anything around the buyer's criteria where they've integrated sustainability into how they weight that in their purchasing decisions?
At this point, what they've indicated is that their customers have responded very positively to understanding the carbon impact as well as the cost and capabilities of the playgrounds. So it's become a factor in their decision making, but not the only factor. I mean, I think just like with other somewhat subjective factors like quality, carbon is being integrated into the decision process of buyers around the world.